specific questions about what foundations' capacity strengths and challenges are so that foundations can work towards making changes to be more effective. We see this an issue both for individual foundations and for the sector as a whole, so that it can begin to hold itself accountable for its own effectiveness in a way that's really parallel to what we expect of our grantees. And in that context, I would just note that we know from the aggregate analysis that we'll be sharing now today that just under 80% of you actually support capacity building activities for your grantees. So it's a quite sturdy percentage of you. And I think that that reflects the understanding that's been omnipresent for a long time that internal capacity is critical to nonprofit effectiveness. And accordingly, there's been a lot of conversation about what that entails, and many, many tools exist in the sector, including those that TCC Group has produced to be assessing nonprofit capacity. But there has been comparatively much less attention on what foundations, who are, after all, also nonprofits ourselves, require in this end. And to the extent that there's been any discussion, it's focused in partial ways on things like customer service, if you will, how grantees perceive their foundations, also the efficacy of specific functions like managing payout or grant-making processes, and to some extent also things like, the content expertise that program staff need to be granting in specific areas, but more attention on that than the skills that they might need, the how of how to do their work well. So it's our contention that all of these elements matter, but that additional ones do too, and moreover that they need to be thought of in relation to each other so that institutions themselves are thought of as an integrated whole, and that is the mindset that undergirds the construction of the FCCAT tool. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Deepti Sood, who will talk about how that tool is constructed and how we're hoping it will be a lever both for elevating attention within foundations and across the sector as a whole to foundation capacity.
Great. Thanks, Melinda. So I will just sort of walk people through the origin of this tool. And so some of you may be aware TCC has a pretty long background thinking about nonprofit capacity. In 2007, we created the Core Capacity Assessment Tool, also known as the FCCAT. And since then, we've had 5,500 individual nonprofits take the tool. Many take it year over year as part of capacity building assessments or just for their own knowledge. And it's organized by core capacity areas that we'll get into a bit. And it's really meant to be a robust self-reporting tool that focuses on all levels of nonprofit capacity. And so as we've been administering this tool over the last 10 years or so, we increasingly heard from funders that they, were interested in a similar tool for foundations, but they weren't able to find one. And there was just sort of an absence of similar assessment tools that funders could use. And so in 2015, we started a process here internally pulling off a lot of outside literature as well as our own internal work with clients, thinking about what capacities do we think that funders really need to be robust foundations. And so when we thought about this question, we went beyond just what are some capacities that we think are specific to foundations to operating well. So, obviously grant-making proficiency is one of those, and we expanded it towards, okay, what are things we think that all foundations need to have, even as just organizations operating in the nonprofit sector that will help them be effective. And so broadening the scope to include things like external and internal vision of leadership. And so in 2015, we piloted with 23 foundations. Everyone received an interpretation session, and we used that information to really create a new and improved tool in 2016 that is, we were able to benefit from the interpretation sessions with the 2015 pilot groups to hear from them, okay, what did they think was missing, what really resonated, what areas needed to be fleshed out. And so In 2016, we were lucky enough to partner with the Ford Foundation, who has also been interested in this question of foundation capacity through their own philanthropy grant making in this space, and they gave the resources for us to investigate what we called a field study for 75 foundations to take the improved FCCAT again, and for us to do some research in terms of, okay, what are some of the trends that we're really learning about foundation capacity here. And so just to orient you a bit to the tool, so the focus is really on learning. It's not meant to be a report card, though you get a numerical number. It's not on, an A through F scale. It's really meant to be sort of a point-in-time assessment that you can use for reflection. It's a self-assessment tool. We have staff take it really reflecting on themselves. We don't have any external stakeholders or grantees take it. It's really meant to be housed in staff or board knowledge in terms of how well you are acting on the behaviors that we ask about. So it really focuses on measuring behaviors instead of attitudes, and then it focuses on 5 core capacities and 43 subcapacities. And the core capacities are outlined here, so anyone who's taken the FCCAT, these should read as fairly familiar. But leadership, adaptive, organizational culture, management, and technical, and we'll go through in a bit a little more about each of these. So in 2016, we had 58 foundations take the FCCAT. We have 54 foundations who we had data in time to be included in the aggregate sample. So when we report data today, we're focusing on those 54 organizations. And we had 3 or more staff take it from each foundation. This is really the number where we felt you had sort of enough cross-pollination of staff that it was a robust reflection, but it wasn't, so high of a bar that smaller private or family foundations couldn't participate. So to talk a bit more about what the core capacities are, leadership capacity really focuses on the ability of organizational leaders to create and sustain the foundation vision. So, work around inspiration, prioritization, making decisions, innovation, providing direction, all focused under leadership capacity. Adaptive focuses on the foundation's ability to monitor, assess, and respond to changes in both the internal and external environment. Management focuses on the foundation's ability to ensure effective and efficient uses of your organizational resources, whether these are money-based, staff-based, time-based, anything broadly within the definition of resources. Technical capacity is your ability to implement key organizational and programmatic functions through your available technologies, tool, staff skills. So not limited to just technology software, but broader, having the resources necessary to really implement the work that you need. And then finally, we have this fifth core capacity of organizational culture. And this one is sort of, softly embedded in all the other areas, but tied most closely, we believe, to leadership. But really looking at the values, assumptions, and behavioral norms that guide out how the foundation is carrying out its work. And so each of these, we really see as important in terms of putting capacity building in context. And so, while they stand alone, we think looking at them together as a framework is very effective in terms of giving us a robust sense of how different elements of foundation capacity are working together. And so on the next slide, we've just articulated what the subcapacities are in each area. To everyone on the phone who has already received their report, these should look pretty familiar. And so, when we report on the data, we break leadership down, so it's not just one flat score for leadership, but within that you can look at, okay, where are we in terms of advocacy, our commitment to DEI, our foundation vision, etc. So really breaking each core capacity into subcapacities that are more specifically focused on elements that are essential to foundations. And so we wanted to move to just give some background about who took the FCCAT, so who participated in 2016. So you can see in terms of foundation type, we asked people to self-select with the type of foundation they felt best represented them, and private foundations were the most represented with 34% of our sample selecting that option. You can see 44% of our foundations make their grants locally. And in terms of asset size, about a third of the population were between 100 to 400 million in terms of their assets. And when we asked what sort of work these foundations were involved in, you can see that a vast majority are involved in supporting grantee convening and networking, and a pretty similar amount are involved in supporting capacity building and providing direct grants. And so this is sort of interesting because, you know, probably if you look at the field level, more foundations are involved in direct grant making and fewer are involved in supporting capacity building or grantee convening and networking. And so we think this is really just an interesting element of the types of foundations who are interested in an assessment tool like that, are probably also the sorts of foundations who are just interested in capacity building broadly. And in terms of the types of grants, not surprisingly, 83% provide program grants, but a pretty high percentage, 74%, are providing capacity building grants. General operating support is pretty high as well. And so, you know, I just, at this point, want to turn it over to Jared Rayner, who's going to start to walk through some of the broad overall findings from the FCCAT assessment.
Thank you, Deepti. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Melinda mentioned at the outset, we're going to divide the findings into two areas. I'm going to start by talking about some of the high-level findings that we found that speaks to a bigger picture, and then Melinda is going to come back and talk about some of the specifics associated with each of the core capacity areas. To start with, the first takeaway that I wanted to share with everyone was just to note that there was a relatively high level of coherence across organizations in terms of where organizations scored, where their strengths and challenges lay, and one of the questions that we had going into the FCCAT was, do different types of foundations, do foundations with different characteristics, have different types of baseline capacity that they bring to the table? Are community foundations better at relational activities? Are large private foundations, 50 million or more, better at managing complex grants or have higher levels of risk? And interestingly, as we ran the analysis, what we found was that there was no significant differences, statistically speaking, between the different foundation types based on any demographic characteristic at the aggregate level, meaning when we're talking at the larger level. There are some nuances that come up in some of the more specifics of subcapacities and individual items, and Melinda will talk about just a couple of those. But by and large, there are not significant differences that we've seen with this group of organizations, with you all, that in terms of what you reported as baseline capacity. Similarly, another thing that we looked at as we looked at the data was the level of variance between foundations in terms of, or within foundations as well as across foundations, meaning do we see organizations where there are widely different perceptions of what an individual capacity is? as we looked across all of the data, again, at the aggregate level, there were no differences, no elements of variance that emerged. However, again, at the more nuanced levels, there are some areas where we saw within foundations some level of variance where different people in the organization seem to perceive the capacity of the foundation in vastly different ways or statistically significant ways. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway that I wanted to share is that foundations across the board, you all rated yourselves that this is a self-assessment aggregated, we try to control for elements of bias and so forth, but at the end of the day, it is a self-assessment. And what we saw in the self-assessed data was that the foundations in this data set consistently rated, scored the subcapacities as strong or satisfactory in all but just a couple of areas. At the high level, at the aggregate level of leadership, adaptive management, and technical, as well as culture, all of those scores at the aggregate level were in the strong or the satisfactory range. Just as a reminder in terms of the reference point when we say strong, satisfactory, or challenging, the FCCAT scores, like the CCAT scores for the nonprofits, are grouped by ranges, with 230 and greater being strong, 190 to 229 being satisfactory, and less than 190 being challenging. I should say that there is at this time, no overt magic number in terms of these ranges. They're ranges that we were able to test with when we had large amounts of FCCAT data, and we've applied it here to the FCAT to be able to give a basic idea. However, as you can imagine, as foundations find themselves on the bubble in some of these, there's the different categories may blend, and as Melinda and Deepti said, this is we hope that foundations don't view the FCCAT as a report card, and that you start from the premise of you are where you are. And so we provide these ranges as a basic guidepost. However, if you find yourselves with a report where there are a significant number of strengths, that doesn't mean that you don't have any work to do in terms of your own capacity. So with that being said, I want to pose a question to you all as a group. And I want to ask you, and please use your write in or use your hands to vote. I'm curious what you all think was the highest capacity area across the foundations that participated in the study. So take just a moment and answer that question. Which core capacity, leadership, adaptive, management, technical, or culture, do you believe was the highest capacity?
And we'll give people just a minute or so to put their guesses in.
If you are watching this on the WebEx, you will see that there's a little counter that's coming down in terms of time elapsed. We'll give people just a couple more seconds. All right, Deepti, that should be enough time. Let's show what people thought.
Great. So we will close the poll. And it is just calculating, so give us 1 second. All right, there's a countdown here. So we're at 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it looks like the majority of people thought leadership is the highest. followed by people guessing management, then technical, then a group of people who refused to answer the question, and organizational culture and adaptive were tied for last.
Okay. JP, what were the numbers on leadership?
So it looked like about 30% or so of people felt that leadership was the highest.
Okay, and how many thought management?
So 29 thought management.
Okay. So very close between leadership and management, and actually it is management capacity that that came out as the highest of the 5 core capacity constructs. I will confess that I was a little bit surprised by this when I first saw the data, thinking similarly to many of you that leadership might be the strongest area. However, upon reflection and as we really looked into the data, there's a couple of things that are happening with management that I think are interesting things for consideration. First of all is that in the leadership capacity, we see some areas where there is significant variance, and Melinda will talk about that in a few minutes as we look at the leadership scores. But in particular, diversity, equity, and inclusion falls in the leadership score as one of the lower areas of capacity rating. But the second thing is we have reflected on this, and is something that we hope to explore further and certainly get any of your insights that you might be willing and interested in sharing, is that so much of what foundations do is grounded in the management function, managing grant reporting, managing the board docket, managing the financial payout ratio, managing the myriad relationships that foundations have to bring together. And so there's this ongoing element of management that comprises so much of what happens in many foundations. And so if you are doing that on a regular basis, it might stand to reason that that may be one of the strongest capacities that shows up. That's one of our hypotheses. Certainly we don't have enough data to say that conclusively, and something that we will continue to track and be interested to see over time. Up on the screen now, you see in front of you the 5 core capacity scores with management up there at the highest, followed by technical capacity. Technical capacity, just as a reminder, is not just about technology or technological skills, but technical skills pertain to all those skills that a foundation needs to make its work go, including things like evaluation skills, your communication skills, in some foundations, the fundraising function, etc. The lowest 3 capacities, more or less on par with each other, are leadership, adaptive, and organizational culture. So those were the highest scores, or those are the core capacity scores overall. As we look at what were the highest and the lowest subcapacities across all of these, across all of the 43 subcapacities that are in the tool, we see that not surprisingly, a couple of management subcapacities, grant portfolio strategy development and grantee relationship management, both come out in the highest overall. As does financial management skills, something that we know foundations pay a lot of attention to, rightly so. And then a leadership and an adaptive subcapacity, leadership being external leadership, which was interesting given all the leadership subcapacities that Melinda will talk about in a moment, that external leadership rose to the top as the strongest of the leadership capacities, external leadership being that element of engaging with the external environment, inspiring, encouraging, motivating others to be able to act towards a vision. And foundation networks, the ability to pull other foundations together or operate in consort with other foundations. On the flip side, well, actually, before I do that, one of the interesting things as we looked across these 5 highest overall was the similarity or the underlying theme of looking at relationships or managing relationships. So when you look at the external leadership function, the foundation network function, and the grantee relationship management function, all of these pertain in one way or another to relationships and how a foundation manages or engages productively with their relationships. We know that this is a core aspect of foundation work, and so somewhat heartening to see it appearing as strengths for the foundations in the pilot group. Building effective foundation networks, field leadership in their chosen areas, and grantee relationship management are these core stakeholder groups with that the foundations interact. As we switch over to the lowest overall capacities, as I mentioned a moment ago, the lowest overall subcapacity was a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI, the score actually falls in the challenge category across all foundation demographics. In the aggregate sample, FCCAT respondents with institutions, within institutions also significantly differ in their appraisal of foundation capacity in this area. So this is one of those areas that within foundations, there is a high level of variance in terms of perception related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The low DEI capacity score is in keeping with other findings from the field, including those from the D5 coalition that work to advance philanthropy's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And their reports, if you followed them over a number of years, continuously highlighted the challenges that foundations commonly face in addressing this critical issue. It's noteworthy to note that FCCAT respondents indicate that their institutions demonstrate a strong commitment to recruiting diverse staff. So within diversity, equity, and inclusion, the commitment to recruiting diverse staff is high, but the execution on that and the internal policies and procedures are areas that where foundations appear to struggle. So the apparent disjuncture that we see in terms of a high score attributed to, we believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but our ability to capitalize on that is significantly lower. One of the interesting things that I think Melinda will talk about a little bit later is that there is a separate capacity around cultural competency, and divergent from diversity, equity, and inclusion. Cultural competency was actually rated fairly highly across the foundation groups. The other lowest overall score was evaluation capacity. This is something that in a recently released report by the Center for Evaluation Innovation and the Center for Effective Philanthropy that showed some data that highlighted the challenges that foundations face and some of the evolution in the evaluative function. It was not a surprise to see this in the lower level, and something that foundations, despite a commitment, continue to struggle with or appear to struggle with in terms of finding the right home, processes, and procedures related to effective evaluation practices. Other areas of lowest overall capacity include demonstrating transparency, something that a number of efforts have highlighted over the years. Advocacy, something that foundations have a somewhat tepid relationship with in many instances, and a data-informed approach, which goes hand in hand with that evaluative function. So those are the highest and the lowest overall subcapacity scores. I'm going to turn it over to Melinda, who's now going to dig a little bit deeper into each of the 5 core capacity areas and provide us with a little bit more nuanced understanding. Linda?
Again, everyone. Just a few quick observations. I want to be, Jared very helpfully covered a lot within each of these categories, so I don't want to duplicate. So let me just say a few additional things, and then we will be able to have time together to probe more deeply about what we do know and what we don't know, and your own experience and your own looking at what you've learned from your own assessments will be helpful for filling in some gaps as well. So the leadership capacity area, which I believe you all imagine might be the strongest, was not, though it was still a strong area. It was, its overall rating was 225, so it's sort of solidly towards the top of the satisfactory range, but it's the middle of the core capacities that we looked at. Remember that we were looking at leadership, the concept of leadership broadly. This is not just the chair of the board or the ED or CEO. It's rather leadership across the institution. The scales that were, the subscales that were highest have to do with demonstration of leadership external to a foundation. So things like the relationship between a foundation and its funding peers, its relationship with community members or other critical stakeholders, as well as the effective communication of a foundation's vision to its external partners. As Jared mentioned, distressingly and not altogether surprisingly, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, come across as the lowest of the subscales in leadership and actually the lowest of the subscales across the FCAT overall. And also probably not that surprisingly, there is differences of opinion among staff internal to a foundation as to how they perceive the diversity, equity, and inclusion strengths. So even though there were some that regarded it more challenging than others, overall it still pops up as the most challenging of areas, but it is an area where we see really strong variance around how different people within institutions regard their own institutions in this arena. You don't see this in the numbers that are in front of you on the screen, but just unpacking it a bit, there was a strong perception that foundations are, in fact, committed to diversifying their staff, and yet this is a low score. So how do you make sense of that? It seems from us, and you'll be able to tell us more, that what's going on here is what D5 and other efforts have borne out, which is that identifying, hiring, onboarding, and often retaining diverse staff are persistent challenges for the sector, even when there is an expressed commitment to diversifying staff members. Interestingly, there was a difference that we saw with how respondents rated their boards, and they seem to appear to suggest that the boards themselves are more diverse and better reflecting their communities. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. The one thing I would say is that the DEI findings, we had a number of questions about if low diversity, equity, and inclusion scores correlated to other kinds of capacities. Was being low in this domain something that affected then other low capacity scores? And we did not see statistical correlations except for in the realm of advocacy capacity, where we saw that if you were stronger in advocacy capacity, you were also stronger in DEI. So that will be an interesting area to probe and learn what that's about. Obviously, not all foundations in general and in our sample actually engage directly in advocacy capacity themselves or support it externally, but we did see that correlation. Okay. So the next area is in adaptive capacity. This also was a capacity that fell into the satisfactory realm, just underneath, a hair's breadth underneath leadership. And this is really about, put another way, being a learning organization. It's about taking information in external to a foundation and internally and assessing it and being able to respond strategically. It doesn't mean losing one's strategic anchors completely. It means holding on to what's there but knowing when and how to modify them in real time in order to be responsive to and seize opportunities as they arrive. You know, arguably foundation work is continuously requiring making sense of lots of different kinds of data, grantee proposals, reports, field trends, trends in the issue area or one funds, formal evaluations, et cetera. So it's perhaps not surprising that this is an area where we see some strengths in this area. The areas that come up strongest, as Jared mentioned, are those, interestingly, that have to do with the issue of relationships, a funder's relationships with its grantees, with other peer funders, and with stakeholders. It would be fascinating in time to be able to compare how foundations are assessing their own strengths in these realms with how their grantees are assessing them through things like the Grantee Perception Report and others. We obviously don't have that kind of a data here, but these are areas, as Jared mentioned, the environmental learning foundation networks and enabling networks among one's grantees that were rated quite strong. The lowest ratings come in this arena about how to use all the different kinds of data that foundations gather to be informing their strategy development. This comes out lowest in this construct of adaptive capacity, and it's actually the second lowest subcapacity in the entire FCCAT itself. And it seems that what foundations in particular are wrestling with is a lack of criteria for determining whether or not their work is effective, lack or absence of systems to be assessing it regularly, and a lack of an ability to share and use that data as they'd like to be informing making decisions. So while folks did talk about and did rate strongly that they had a lot of data available to them, it was how to actually use that data best to advance the foundation's core work that was less strong. Okay, management, as you learned from the poll results, is actually the strongest area overall. 7 out of the 8 subscales in this area were rated as strong. As Jared noted, maybe this isn't so surprising since managing different kinds of things is a big, big chunk of what foundations do. But it is interesting for us, given that we're also used to looking at how nonprofit organizations rate themselves through our complementary FCCAT tool, and this is consistently an area of great challenge for nonprofits across all the different domains, the different subscales of management that are identified here. You know, our conjecture, which again, interested in your thoughts, is that comparatively, foundations have greater resources that they can apply internally to fulfilling these management functions than our often starved nonprofit organizations have at their disposal. The lowest score among all these high scores for management concerns the area of risk. The issue of risk tolerance is not a new one for the sector. This came up lowest here. Potentially, hard to know, driven either by the lack of clear systems internal to foundations for assessing trade-offs that foundations may want to consider when they're pursuing risk strategies, or dispositional aversion to being disinclined to take on risk. So that also is an area that we hope to be learning more about as we probe deeper. Technical capacity is the overall area of greatest strength for foundations. There were many subcapacities in this arena, 12, and 6 of them actually come up strong, with the remainder being satisfactory. Again, by contrast, this is an area where typically nonprofits really struggle, and one could theoretically surmise that here too foundations have greater resources to be able to allocate towards either strengthening the skills of their staff or acquiring the material goods that are constituting part of what is in this technical construct. But all that said, there's a lot of variance here, more variance than we've seen in the other core capacity constructs. And by that I mean that different people within their individual institutions differently rated whether or not there was strong or weaker technical capacity. And that leads us to conjecture that either there's perhaps differential access to some of the goods within foundations overall, or that different parts of foundations have staff that are quite differently displaying some of the technical skills that are identified here, and that those are therefore perceived differently depending on where one's looking by the staff as they're thinking about their institution as a whole. The highest overall scores in this have to do with managing finances, doing the actual work of grant making, and interestingly, cultural competency skills. And here let me refer back to Jared's commenting on this with the DEI findings. This is a different scale. It was a scale that overall across the aggregate sample came up very strongly. And what folks seemed to be saying was that their staff had strong abilities to be relating to people who were different from themselves. Now recognize that they're saying this, and at the same time we're seeing that staff are saying that their staffs are not sufficiently diverse. So there's perhaps an irony in there, but looked at more positively, it also could be suggesting a statement that people feel that there is a demonstration and a commitment to the expressed values of DEI, and that there are capacities to be able to live them, and that those capacities are strong across this wide variety of foundation types that took the FCCAT tool. The challenge still remains that the institutions themselves must become more diverse nonetheless. The two areas that were lowest in the technical realm are evaluation, and Jared has touched upon that a bit already, as have I. The goods are there. The ability to use those goods intelligibly to make a difference is wanting, and fundraising is also a lower capacity area. And not surprisingly, I'm sure for all of you, fundraising is consistently the capacity area that is, of course, most challenging for nonprofits, and this seems to spill over into foundations as well. Obviously, only a subset of the foundations that responded to this tool actually engage in fundraising. That's the community foundations and the public foundations. And the private foundations, and those that did not engage in fundraising were advised simply to skip over these items. So these scores here don't reflect the fact that a chunk of the foundations that actually took the tool don't engage in fundraising. The properties of the analysis account for that. The last category is organizational culture. This is an unusual kind of funky area to be thinking about in terms of capacity. I want to underscore that our tool and our assessment was not claiming that a certain kind of organizational culture is good or bad. Rather, we were looking at a set of behavioral norms that are recognized within institutions, and you see those norms here, and trying to glean how those that responded to the tool saw those values being demonstrated or not. And it's quite interesting that there was considerable cohesion among those that took the tool. So we saw no variance here, meaning that across the aggregate sample, people perceived what was going on in terms of their organizational culture in similar ways, and that's not always the case. So for me, that was among the biggest surprises, actually, of this entire assessment. The scores that were highest had to do with demonstrating accountability. Let me just clarify that this is accountability for leaders in making decisions. I think that there's a rich and important conversation often about how accountable or not are foundations to the wider sector. This does not reflect that. Accountability here is about internally how are leaders held accountable for making decisions that advance their mission. Also, empowerment of staff. Interestingly, across foundations, respondents felt that staff received the supports needed for their professional development and growth and empowerment. And last, and interestingly, that there was a clear and consistent recognition of explicit lived values, and folks perceive those values in similar ways. So Jared, let me turn it back to you. I don't know if you want to just open this up for questions and comments, or if you want to add on to any of those more specific observations in terms of the individual capacity areas before we open it up.
Thanks, Linda. No, I'm not going to add anything. You've heard from us long enough. These are the findings. Do want to open it up. This is an opportunity for both questions and discussion. Would ask folks, to be concise as we move through, but would love to hear from all of you. I think in terms of process, you are all currently muted, so I would say if you raise your hand, we can unmute you, or you can type a question or a comment into the chat box. If you are on the phone, Deepti, I don't know how we manage the people on the phone.
So I think everyone should be able to go ahead and type into the chat box. And as you do that, we will just read your question out loud and then respond.
All right, so if you have comments, clarifications, questions, surprises, areas that you would like to probe further or suggest for research.
So we got our first question in, which was, how can you use the findings to help make decisions or prioritize allocations of resources to tackle current challenges?
And the second question actually is a part of the answer, which is, how do you propose sharing these findings with others in the foundation and with foundation leadership? So let me start with speaking to that, and then Jared, please, or Deepti, follow on in terms of prioritizing. I mean, we really, just to go back to what Deepti said at the very beginning of the call, we see this entire tool as an invitation for reflection among the critical people engaged within the foundation, whether that's staff or board or some combination thereof. And so the first step that we recommend is convening different clusters of folks within your foundation to make sense of these findings and to look at them and to go through, if they surprise you, if they don't surprise you, what do you think that they consist of, and to really reflect on them diagnostically. There are at the back of the individual FCCAT reports that each institution has received or should be receiving, has all received, a set of questions to prompt those conversations. We often, TCC Group, participates in what we call interpretation sessions with organizations as they're reflecting on these. We've done this for many years with the FCCAT. They're really just a vehicle for facilitated conversations to reflect back how your findings compare to others, particularly others that are of the foundation type that you're a part of, whether a community foundation, private foundation, et cetera, and to enable a conversation to begin to unpack those. It's not always the case that capacities that are identified as being on the weaker end are necessarily of concern to your foundation. They may simply reflect the fact that for whatever reasons your foundation doesn't prioritize those areas. So we always urge folks to realize that what is important is what you yourselves identify as being most important rather than an objective frame on that. I'm just looking at Deepti or Jared. If you'd like to speak about this a bit as regards both FCCAT and the processes that people go through or other pieces, please chime in.
So one of the things that we have learned is that how the conversation unfolds is important to getting into action. And I think that sitting down, that designing however your foundation approaches it's decision-making in general, that applying a similar kind of approach to engaging with your FCCAT findings is warranted. I say it in that way because different foundations, different organizations have different ways that they engage in the decision-making process, and if you try and make this something different, that it may represent, people may react to the different process and funnel their reaction to the different process through their findings. So if they use whatever process you currently use for decision making, with one caveat being that if your decision making process doesn't currently involve the people who participated in taking the FCCAT, that you need to modify your process to include those people, because at a minimum, it's our recommendation that the findings should be shared with the people who participated in, that contributed their thinking and ideas to the scoring for your foundation. In addition to that, the question about process is one that, as Melinda pointed out, we have 5 actions for consideration. There's nothing radical in any of those, but what we don't want to happen is folks to sit down and look at a set of scores as a report card. So it's orienting folks, it's setting up the agenda for reviewing the FCCAT findings such that it's framed as a conversation for action. The last thing that I'll say in terms of the question around prioritization, I think Melinda hit on this, but I just want to re-emphasize this, is that there is a tendency with when we get whatever evaluation report or survey data back to jump to the lowest scores and focus all of our attention on those lowest scores. I think one of the advantages of the FCCAT, and Melinda mentioned this at the outset in terms of the conception, is that we wanted a holistic tool. We wanted a tool that covered a lot of different things. And so the idea that you would go through this process to look at capacity writ large across the foundation, and then you get your report and suddenly go back to focusing on laser-like on an individual problem, runs a little bit anathema to the concept of looking at capacity as a whole within the foundation. And so we would encourage you to sit down, have a conversation, asking those questions: what do we think? What do we agree with? What do we disagree with? You're certainly free to disagree with the findings from the FCCAT, but it should be generative in terms of a conversation. Why do you disagree? Upon what are you basing your conclusions, so that it opens up that conversation? And then at the end of the day, whatever you choose to act on, be deliberate and concrete, identifying both short and long-term aspects that you can hold yourselves accountable to in terms of making progress on the particular area.
I wanted, just before we go to the next question, to add on an additional thought, which is that Jared and I have been talking about making sense of these results collectively within your foundation, independent of other processes. And it's also often the case that this can be used in concert with some kind of strategic inquiry that you're already undertaking. So we are increasingly doing these as a part of a diagnostic with foundations as they're looking at strategic planning, for example, or looking at strategy redevelopment for a particular program area, if not the institution overall. Also potentially helpful to look at some of these issues as you're doing some kind of a program evaluation or program assessment. So, and other forums, processes that your foundation may have for routinely making meaning together. So there's the things that we've been discussing already for deliberately and intentionally starting conversations around this, but thinking also about the potential uses of this within what you're already doing is also another way to think about proceeding. I would say what you should not be doing is thinking about this as something to be wrapping into any kind of a performance review for staff. I've had a few foundations with whom we've done interpretation sessions after taking this ask me if this would be appropriate when they're seeing areas that come up lower, therefore conclude, oh, does this mean that staff associated with these quality, with these attributes need to be addressing this. And the tool is not designed for that. The properties don't make sense in that way, and I would really urge not thinking about it in any way along those lines.
Great. Thanks, Jared and Melinda. The next question asked if we will be sharing the PowerPoint, which we are happy to do so. We will email a link with both the deck and the recorded webinar to participants after this call. And Melinda will talk a bit about next steps, which includes other resources we'll be releasing about the FCCAT. A following question is, someone asks, what plans do you have about offering opportunities to foundations to learn from this with each other?
We would love to do that. So I was going to talk about this a little bit with next steps, but so we are hungry to share these results, and we are hungry to learn more ourselves. Since, as I mentioned at the top of the call, really our objectives are to elevate attention to this issue, and it's a very new conversation. So foundations sharing with each other what they've got, how they make sense of this, what does and doesn't seem right, how this aligns, as I mentioned before, with what we know grantees think in terms of foundation capacity across many of these realms. These would all be really rich conversations. Our own hope is to be sharing these results through various kinds of writing. We've just completed a narrative report on this, which goes into much greater detail than we were able to today, and that is now with a designer, and that will be out early in the year. We hope to then be able to speak to this at any number of different kinds of funder conferences, and to not just, again, have us be sharing the information, but to be using that as a way to have facilitated conversations among foundations. We'll be doing that with some of the Regional Association of Grant Makers as well. But we would heartily and enthusiastically welcome your suggestions for the best ways to go about doing that, and any forums that you think would be particularly right for talking, or any ways that you think it would be most productive to be catalyzing these kinds of conversations. We're all ears and would love to think with you more about that.
So Jenna Manders asked about sharing data specific to one type of foundation, like community foundation, and this speaks to this same concept. We will be releasing reports based on specific demographics so that folks can look at those in isolation. Again, I would just note that the differences are not statistically significant at this point, but we will be releasing those reports over a period of time. Joyce asked about or mentioned that, that it was surprising that respondents suggested that their boards were more diverse, reflective of their communities and their staffs. How was the question posed to lead to this conclusion? And just quickly, the question is similar. So there's one, the composition of our staff reflects the communities we serve, and the composition of our board reflects the communities we serve. So the same framing for each, and again, I would echo your surprise, Joyce, that boards were perceived more so than staff.
Great, thanks, Jared. We have some more questions that popped up in our chat box. So one person mentioned at United Way that they're both a nonprofit and a foundation. They're taking the CCAT hand in hand with the FCCAT, and it could be cool to do some comparisons there. We absolutely agree. We are looking into our CCAT database to see if in the upcoming months we can do some analysis that sort of talks more about, for items or subcapacities that are similar, what are differences we're seeing by organizational type. And I think it's a super interesting area to dive into. Another question somebody asked if we saw any noticeable trends in adaptive capacity or commitment to DEI based off the size of foundation or asset size. And we actually saw no trends in that regard. So we found pretty much across the board, regardless of what your foundation demographics are, you scored subcapacities pretty similarly within DEI and also within adaptive capacity, which was intriguing to us because we sort of posited there might be some differences based off size or area of focus, but none that panned out with the data set we have right now.
Which is true across the tool for all.
Which is true, yeah, for every subcapacity across the entire tool. And then somebody asked, they said in their foundation FCAT report, the variance column was left blank. So that means that there were no subcapacities that were variant. So overall in your foundation, staff, regardless of rank or whatever other demographics, rated questions generally the same. So if you don't have any token in your variance column, it indicates there wasn't a lot of variance. So people were pretty cohesive in terms of how they answered that question.
Deepti, if I could just pick up on a couple of others as I'm looking here. Kathleen Dean suggested for further research the extent of evaluation data learning function within foundations. Is there a full-time or part-time function? How long has it been part of the organizational structure? Fortunately, someone's already done this research, and this is the report that I just mentioned that recently came out, not more than a month ago, from the Center for Effective Philanthropy and the Center for Evaluation Innovation, where they looked in depth at this question around foundations and staffing and how those staff are allocated. It's well worth the read if you haven't seen it. Josh, Terry, thank you for the suggestion that it would be helpful to see averages next to our own scores. It's something that we considered. We didn't have the full, we were concerned about how full the data set was. As we move forward, it's something that we will consider doing, sort of the side-by-side, which is something that the FCCAT does allow for. So really appreciate that as a suggestion. Again, Kathleen suggested, you talked about some experience that they have at their foundation in terms of taking a holistic view, and she shared that we are connecting our FCAT findings to similar themes we've identified through other forms of self-assessment and addressing through those themes rather than just through the FCAT scores to avoid the report card approach. As a flip to that, Nancy Bird, who is a longtime facilitator of FCCAT, mentioned that she said, quote, "No matter how it's presented, the participants cannot get beyond the ingrained conditioning to look at the scores and consider them as successes or failures." A point well taken, well presented, and accurate, Nancy. Nancy went on to ask the question, have we considered redesigning the reports and scoring? And I will say we have not. We have considered it. We have chosen not to do it, and part of the reason is we've every version that we've thought about lends itself to one way or the other some aspect of that. And one of the things that we find is really helpful to get around that is having people who do the interpretation sessions who can help guide those conversations from an external perspective, who aren't going to get mired, who don't have the stake in the A's and F's sort of concept, but can look at things in a more objective way and say, here's sort of the patterns that we see, and help manage that conversation. I'll throw back to you, Deepti, in case some others.
Betsy Fairbanks has asked a question about, was there a typical number of participants that took the FCAT and what was the range? So, you know, we required only at least three, so that there was anonymity. The foundation sizes differed so much from each other that the actual number of people that took it within an institution obviously also differed significantly. But on average, about 70% of foundation staff participated in taking the tool. So we were pleased with the level of saturation, even though that was not something that we had specified as a requirement.
I have a couple of others here. Kate asked, did you find a balance of strengths and challenges across foundations, or alternatively, did those that perform strong tend to perform strong across most capacities and vice versa. We actually saw a real mix, Kate. There were some that were strong across the board and some that were weak across the board and some that were strong in some areas and weak in the others. So there was no one singular pattern. However, as we mentioned in terms of the findings themselves, because as a whole there are so many high levels of capacity, the scores did tend to lend or lean on the strength side of things as a general trend. One other thing, again, Josh asked the question, is it possible for us to get a list of the questions that determine the scores? We would like to have a broader conversation, but it's hard to work back from the numbers. And so this is an area where we are happy to share the full list, a randomized list of all the items. The construction of the scales themselves is proprietary, and we do not share the scaled list of items. So sorry about that, but that's one thing we do. However, I can tell you from our experience with the FCCAT, having done both, is that it's that thinking about the concepts from a construct, so thinking about the subcapacities as the subcapacities without getting distracted by, well, what's really in here, we have found actually can enhance the conversation because it helps folks avoid getting mired in the weeds. And so not that all of the items are weeds, but engaging in that conversation at the subcapacity level with those definitions that are provided, we have found actually is as helpful, if not more so, than when we share item level responses. But as I mentioned, we do not share the scales as they are proprietary.
So those are all the questions that we see for now.
I would just love to again invite, if there are any comments that people have in terms of suggestions for areas that you think would be important for us to probe further, this is the beginning for us. We have this very rich database. We have 58 foundations who have taken this, which is a lot given that there have not been other foundations taking any comparable tool as far as we're aware. But we have 5,500 nonprofits that have taken the FCCAT. So, you know, the N for foundations will obviously never be anywhere near as large, but we are really hoping over time that we're expanding the database of foundations that are interested in thinking about this with us and doing the work internally that's suggested based on what they find. And we are also at the beginning of making meaning of the data that we have ourselves. So your questions, whether now or sent to us afterwards, about correlations that you'd be curious for us to probe are very much welcome. We have ourselves probed a set of correlations around DEI, as you've heard about today. We've also asked a lot of questions around collaboration and collaborative capacity, which is an arena that we all believe is critically important and are committed to here at TCC, and I think to a considerable extent across the sector. But we wanted to get a better understanding of how collaborative power, both within a foundation internally and with external partners, may or may not have an impact on other capacity areas. And we've seen correlations so far, as I mentioned, I think earlier, between that and adaptive capacity, but not other arenas as yet. But these are also areas that we intend to probe further. So please think with us and help our thinking with your own suggestions in this regard.
Melinda, if I could just say two things in closing. One is, in addition to the work that you're doing at an individual level, going back to the question about building the field and so forth, we encourage and invite all of you to help us generate a conversation about foundation capacity and raise that more to the forefront as a field, and you all as early adopters of the FCCAT, you know, demonstrating your commitment and interest in this area. But if you have ideas in terms of how we can continue to highlight not the FCCAT itself, but the concept of foundations paying more attention to their capacity as a whole, we would love for your ideas, engagement, you know, project ideas on that front. The last thing I will say is just I will take a point of personal prerogative and you know, thank my colleagues at TCC Group, you know, as we've been working on this for a couple of years, as Deepti mentioned, but also want to thank Chris Cardona, who I know is on the phone at the Ford Foundation. Chris is not our program officer on this for this project, but he's been such a supporter both of the concept of thinking about foundation capacity and supporting the sector, but also was an incredible thought partner with us early on as we were beginning the design and development of the FCCAT. So I wanted to acknowledge his role and support and thank him for that. So that's all I had, and Melinda, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Sure. I think that we've actually already gone through these various next steps in the conversation over the past few minutes. So I will simply close by reiterating Jared's last comment that as much as we feel we have a rich body of information to share, we also feel very clear that that will be enriched by learning from each of you how you are making sense of what you've learned from your reports and how you think we can together elevate attention to this arena, which has really not been an area that has been much discussed in philanthropy before. So please send us, we will be sending things out to you in terms of the link for this webinar, PowerPoint, et cetera, but a warm, enthusiastic, and very, very strong shout out to ask you to please send us thoughts, observations, critiques, comments, positive and negative, and ideas for how to move forward. We depend on those, and together I think we'll be able to really help to elevate attention to this very important issue. And thank you so much.